Tudor Galos. I'm a ePrivacy consultant. I've been doing this in the past 2 years, before GDPR appeared. And I'm working with, or me and my team, we are working with over 70 customers throughout Europe, trying to help them become 100% GDPR compliant. Oh, by the way, just a show of hands, how many of you think your companies you work in are 100% GDPR compliant? Okay, one. Good. Actually, this is the truth. No one can be 100% GDPR compliant. Actually, making a percentage is a tough thing because you need to know how do you calculate this percentage. But you can take certain action to become as compliant as you can. And today we are going to discuss 10 privacy tips and tricks for big data scenarios. First of all, everyone is saying, oh, GDPR is not about fines. However, we already have over 100 fines throughout Europe for all types of privacy mistakes, let's say, or privacy practices which were against the law. And of course, we have many other controls and many other issues of corrections done by data protection authorities. And we also have a lot of companies showing other companies that are not, let's say, compliant. But however, the worst thing that can happen is not the fine. Actually, I've seen cases where the data protection authority is saying, okay, you need to stop this processing. And that could be pretty harmful for the company. Or, by the way, you need to change your systems. We have a bank which received a 3-month deadline to basically change the critical core banking application. So you can imagine that in 3 months it's a little bit difficult to change a critical core banking application. So again, the fine is not the worst thing, and people do make this mistake a lot. Okay, trying to avoid the fine. However, again, that's not the biggest problem that can happen to a company. Also, based on our experience, defining all the actors in a big data scenario is pretty difficult. You have many vendors, you have many third parties, you have applications, you have systems, you have databases, you have cloud operators, and so on. And what role do the cloud operators have? Of course, a lot of times the cloud operators are saying, wait a minute, we are just data processors. However, we have a situation in Netherlands where, for example, cloud operator was declared as joint controllers because they did telemetry. And a lot of cloud operators are doing telemetry. And telemetry is not part of the instructions given by the data controller to the data processor. So guess what? It's their own controlling operations, so they are joint controllers. Also, in big data scenarios, limiting the processing of personal data is a challenge. Because this is how big data works. You generate new variables, you generate new numbers, new indicators, new attributes, new data points. So limiting the processing of personal data can be a huge challenge. Also, we'll discuss this today. GDPR compliance is basically a risk-based approach. And the biggest issue that we are seeing in big data scenarios is that data sets, which are non-personal, can become personal data very easy. And that's a big issue. Because a lot of times people are saying, I saw data specialists saying, oh, this is not personal data. And I ask, okay, but what's with this ID? Where this ID leads to? And yes, and many times it led to an individual. So, team number 1 is understand the challenge. Let's say you have a data set, which is part of a bigger data set, and part of this really big data set, you have some personal data, like a customer ID. You don't know who the customer is, but we'll switch back to the definition of personal data, saying that personal data is any data or set of data that can lead directly or indirectly to the identification of an individual. Indirectly means I don't need to know who that person is. If a machine can determine who that person is based on the data sets which are provided to the machine, that is personal data. And the biggest issue is that the whole data set becomes personal data. Imagine this was the biggest issue that Cambridge Analytica had, because in a declaration in a video, which was in 2016, Mr. Nix, the former president of Cambridge Analytica, specifically said that they were following over 4,000, between 4,000 and 6,000 data points for every person, adult person in the United States. So yes, actually you might have a lot of personal data. And if you want to depersonalize, let's say, the data set, actually what you need to do is full anonymization. And that is really difficult, because full anonymization doesn't mean removing only one string or only one data or only one identifier. You need to make sure that this anonymization is irreversible. Otherwise, it's just pseudonymization, is just a security measure. Moreover, there is a regulation in the European Union called the Regulation on Framework for the Free Flow of Non-Personal Data, which is saying the following thing. Basically, if you have a data set which is personal data, and that data set is inextricably linked to a bigger data set, the whole bigger data set becomes personal data. Of course, this is in legalese, so it's like if the non-personal data and the personal data parts are inextricably linked, the data protection rights and obligations stemming from the GDPR apply to the fully mixed data set. So that's a big issue, because we often say, oh no, we just process a small part of personal data, and we ignore the biggest part of our data, which just became personal data. And this is a common scenario in big data, especially, for example, when you do a research on insurance, okay? Like in MTPL, motor insurance, you have those devices which are installed on cars, which make an analysis of how the driver is driving the car. And if you are driving, you know, really slow, really careful, you'll have a really nice insurance rate. However, if you drive like a maniac, your insurance rate goes up. The problem that there is a lot of data which is being calculated there. How is the machine calculated the fact that the driver is irresponsible? What are the categories of drivers? What other data can be deducted? So there is a lot of personal data. You just cannot say, oh, the only personal data is the GPS route of the device and how we evaluate the driving style of the driver. You actually have acceleration, deceleration. All these indicators are personal data. Second tip, privacy by design. Everybody is talking privacy by design and by default, and no one is actually saying what the hell this is. So privacy by design has several important components. There is a document by Anne Kevukian saying 7 principles. From 7, I took one out because I actually put it in here. Privacy as the default setting. Proactive and preventative. This means actually develop an internal culture of personal data protection. Actually saying, okay, we need to minimize the quantity of data we are processing. We need to take the end person, the end customer, and put it in the center of the processing. We need to overview their interests, our legal interests, to balance them. So it's a culture thing. Privacy as the default setting. This means actually minimizing the quantity of data that we are processing. Actually doing the minimization, asking ourselves, do we actually need this data? In most of my 70 customers, we managed to decrease the quantity of data being processed just by asking the question, why do you need this? And a lot of my customers saying, this is how we did it. This is how it was done previously by my predecessors. This is our culture, but actually why? What are you using this data for? Oh, we are not using it. We're just collecting it. No, you don't need to process tons of data. Full functionality, positive sum. Now, there is a balance always in the individual interest versus the interest of the business. And the biggest issue here is that a lot of companies are saying, look, this GDPR is killing my business. We are running out of business due to GDPR. Well, what I'm saying is that if GDPR implementation affects your business, you're doing it wrong. Because Moreover, it should optimize your business. It's a digital transformation thing. It's a simplification thing. You actually review all your processes and you simplify them. You don't need tons of data. One of my customers, which is a big customer in terms of cinema data, processing cinema data and movies, actually had a ton of data which was being processed. And I asked, why do you need the individual IDs? You don't need. Okay, you do telemetry. Anonymize it. And they said, yeah, but we don't know when we might use it. Wrong approach. If you don't make money on the data, don't use it. You don't actually need it. End-to-end security. Clearly, it's simple. Protect the data. Make sure wherever the data flows, it flows securely and it cannot be intercepted. Visibility and transparency. Make it transparent. Don't hide your personal data processing, because at some point in time, it will be identified and people will see what you actually do with their data. So what is absolutely important is to make sure you're transparent here. Okay, don't hide it. Anyway, part of the privacy notices that we'll discuss, you actually need to explain to everyone what you're doing with the data. And finally, respect for the user privacy. Keep it user-centric. If you wouldn't like a certain processing operation done with your data, don't do it on someone else's data. Because personal data actually means the lives of people. It's just not like simple numbers put in a machine. They are the lives of persons. So please respect it. How you can do this? Basically, you can collect feedback. You can ask and work with your data subjects for them to understand why are you processing the data and why would you like them to entrust you with their data, because that's the right word. They don't sell you their data, they entrust you with their data. It's a trust-based relationship which is being set for the long-term gain of your business. However, this needs to be scaled at the level of the business. Okay, you have the privacy by design and by default principle as the cornerstone of your company, as the foundation of your company. But you need to build business practices and processes on this. It doesn't simply, it's not a declaration, like we are going to respect user privacy. No, you actually need to substantiate it. You need to have business processes and practices which actually reflect this. The way you are minimizing internal policies on anonymization and pseudonymization of data, on minimization of data, reviewing all the data sets in the databases, reviewing all the values, not all the values, all the variables, all the data points, all the attributes, to make sure you understand what is personal data there and whether it can be minimized and what security measures you are taking. Infrastructure and system, which is then based on the business practices and processes. And finally, at the top, you have what you sell. Applications, services, products, and so on. They all need to be constructed on this. This is how you scale, actually, privacy. How does this affect your big data scenarios? If you start with privacy in mind, imagine this transition. We've had it, like, I think, 15 years ago, when the security by default principles were outlined. It's nothing new. When security by default principles were outlined, I was in a really big corporation at that point in Microsoft, and we received a lot of feedback from the users and from the businesses. You are killing the business, or the applications are not working anymore. But there were applications which are opening thousands of ports in the computer, inviting hackers and presenting them with flowers once the hackers arrived. So actually, I know it was tough at that time, but this will become the norm. This is actually the norm. You need to put privacy by design and by default at the heart of your business. And then you'll see that databases will actually follow the principle, and actually data minimization, pseudonymization, anonymization, all the other measures will simply follow up as a normal thing. Tip number 4, privacy notice. Privacy notice is one of the most important mechanisms for transparency. It's not easy to do in big data. Why? Because you actually need before saying who you are, what you sell, personal data we need. Here you actually need to list all categories of personal data, including the ones you are calculating or generating. It's not enough to say, for example, oh, we put a device on your machine which collects info about your driving. What info? Does it also collect how many passengers are in my car? Does it also record audio? Does it also record where I'm going? How much am I staying? Can it calculate where I live? Can it calculate what is my job? Can it calculate whether I have an affair or not? That's the strange things. A company in Spain, I mean La Liga in Spain, I don't know if you know the case of La Liga, had an application. It was a really cool application, you know, for people. They found out about games and stuff. However, from time to time, you know what the application did? Activated the microphone. Why? To identify whether that person is GPS located in a bar, which broadcasts the game without paying the fee to La Liga. So it activated the microphone, it recorded several seconds, identified whether there was a sound from the TV, whether the sound matched the sound of the game, and then simply find out a way to find that bar. And of course, they got a really big fine from the Spanish Data Protection Authority. Just, you know, talking about simple applications that gather data in simple devices. No, you actually need to outline all the data categories you are processing here. Then you need to mention the object of processing, scope of processing, and of course, the legal ground. One of the 6 legal grounds, whether it's consent, contract, law, vital interests, public interests, legitimate interest. Then you need to outline all the other controllers or processors receiving data, or categories of controllers or processor, and whether you're shipping data outside the European Union. You might have some processors in the United States, you might have some processors in Russia or in China or in India. You need to actually specifically say how you're transporting data outside the EU, what security measures you are taking, whether they are binding corporate rules or standard contractual clauses or an adequacy decision and so on. You need to have a retention policy. That's also tough for big data. Because especially in business intelligence scenarios, the data scientists are saying, I need all the data. No, I cannot delete anything. I need all the data to be able to analyze it as much as I can. Yes, you can have it, because anonymization is considered destruction of data. But it needs to be full anonymization, without the possibility of coming back to personal data. Meaning without the possibility of re-identifying an individual. And this is not easy. You need to have specific things depending on scenario, what type of data you anonymize, you overwrite, and how much you keep it. But you need to have specific time frames for each category of data. A company in Germany delivering food was fined with a really big amount of money, over 100,000 euros, for keeping inactive customer data for more than 15 years. These were customer accounts, you know, which were created on their platform, where simply users could order food. They didn't delete old customer data, they got fined. Manage the data flows. Data flow management starts simple, with a pencil. Here we have a Visio diagram with data subject, data controller, third parties. It's complicated. You start with a pencil. It can be electronic pencil, of course. But you simply design. I didn't show you my designs because I write really ugly. No, really, really ugly. I write hieroglyphs. So basically you just design all the players. Where is the data subject? Who are the data controllers? Who are the data processors? How is the data flowing? Here you see a simple credit and collection with the document, automatic document checker, an analytic application which is analyzing the documents, a company finance department which is giving the okay for payments, and so on. And you see here you have a lot of data because the customer comes with a set of data, but then extensive data is generated, such as the score You know, the credit score. Credit score is always calculated. It's not something the customer comes with. Oh, by the way, I have the best credit score. No, this is generated personal data. It's the simplest example of generated personal data. But as you know, in credit score, especially in big data scenarios, you analyze a lot of things about a person. In insurance as well, you analyze how that person behaves, from what area this person is. The actuaries do take a lot of things in their calculation when they're calculating the insurance for a specific person, whether it's health insurance, whether it's house insurance, whether it's motor. So a lot of data falls in. And it's not only the data which is collected from the data subject, it's also data which is taken from other sources and data which is calculated by the algorithms. And you need actually to be able to explain that data. If you have AI or machine learning or deep learning algorithms, you don't need to explain the whole logic or how exactly the numbers come out, because those are really variable things. So, but you need to be able to explain the basic things, what this algorithm does, okay, in general terms. Thing number 6, record of processing applications, ROPA. ICO, which is the Data Protection Authority here in the UK, have a really good example for record of processing activities. However, I wanted to have an example of processing which I consider extremely intrusive. Facial gesture automatic assessment. I don't know if you have read the latest article. Some HR companies decided to use facial recognition when they're interviewing people to analyze their emotions. Now, there is a paper called Emotional Expressions Reconsidered Challenges to Inferring Emotion from Human Facial Movements, published on the 17th of July. It's free on the internet. You can Google it and you'll be able to find the paper. Based on it, I made a ROPA insertion, meaning I legally documented the processing. Business function is human resources, purpose of processing is recruitment, category of individuals is candidates. However, look at the categories of personal data. You have emotion category, because the algorithm takes a decision. What emotion do you express? Amusement, anger, awe, contempt, disgust, embarrassment, fear, happiness, pride, sadness, shame, surprise. How they are calculating this? They are looking at your brows position, eyelids position, eye position, jaw position, lips position, head, associated probabilities. This is from the paper. This is how it's done. Then we have categories of recipients, retention timeframes, general description of technical organizational measures, lawful basis. The lawful basis is also pretty hard to determine here, because you have processing is necessary in order to take steps at the request of the data subject to enter in contract. This word necessary is key here, because I can demonstrate it's not necessary. You are replacing a recruiter with a machine, but you could have a recruiter which is not processing personal data because he's not storing this information, while a machine is storing it, and it falls under the definition of GDPR. So yes, there is an alternate weight which proves the fact that necessity is not something specific. Rights available to individual: access, rectification, and erasure, because he or she can request a human intervention. And you have automated decisions, and yes, it requires something called DPIA, Data Protection Impact Assessment. A lot of people feel scared about DPIA. However, it's a risk-based methodology. It's a risk assessment. You need to evaluate the probability of the risk and the impact of the risk materializing. I consider the following 3 risks. There are much more related to the previous processing. First of all, what happens if the data subject has a medical condition which is preventing the correct movement of facial expressions? How will the algorithm interpret that? Second, what if the data subject is tired and this affects the evaluation? Third, what if the data subject belongs to an ethnic minority which simply has different ways to express emotions, and this might lead to unfair evaluation? The last 2 risks, I consider them highly exposed, and yes, you have residual risks, and no, you cannot have at this point measures. You need to ask for the opinion of the authority. It means you have residual risks which require the approval and the assistance of the data protection authority. This is how you make an analysis, a risk-based analysis. Of course, the DPA is much longer, but you need to put a lot of questions to understand all the risks. And I put simply 3 questions. What happens if? Point number 8, the legitimate interest. A lot of big data processing is based on the so-called legitimate interest. I have an interest in processing this data, in generating these numbers, in evaluating the individual and calculating these type of data points. But of course, you need to make something called the purpose test. First of all, can you define your legitimate interest? Why are you doing this? Second of all, the necessity test. Can we do this in an alternate way without processing personal data? Again, a lot of times I found the answer to be yes. It's called minimization. And third, you need to do the so-called balancing tests. What is your interest versus the data subject interest? Are we affecting some data subject rights and freedoms? Such as I might calculate an individual IQ based on how that person navigates on the internet. Would that seriously affect that individual? Yes, it would. It might be unfair, it might be discriminatory, so yes, I need to take additional measures. However, you cannot invoke, usually, the legitimate interest. For example, if you are thinking the following way, would the data subject consent to this processing if I would ask that data subject? If not, highly probable the legitimate interest wouldn't work. Of course, if you have a legitimate interest in protecting your business, such as, for example, using an intrusion detection system on your website, then the answer is yes, you have a legitimate interest there. And of course, the hacker wouldn't consent to that information processing. Tip number 9, monitoring the compliance. You need to check that all your processing are lawful, that the purpose is limited, you are minimizing the data, that the data is accurate. Because in big data scenario, if a single indicator is inaccurate, it will propagate throughout the database and simply affect the whole instance of the data, the whole data set. Limitation of storage, integrity and confidentiality, which in the end leads to accountability. But you also need to monitor the other things. Data protection by design and by default. The fact that it's scaled at the level of the whole organization. Record of processing activities is updated. That you take consideration, isolate personal data, and you can identify all the personal data and the fact that is not separated. And finally, risks. You need to take into consideration all types of risks, including physical risks. What happened with the server in case of a flood, in case of a fire, in case of an earthquake? You need to ask a lot of questions. It's a risk-based approach. And my final tip, Brexit. A lot of people are asking, oh my God, what will happen with personal data after Brexit? First of all, EU and UK have decided to work together to have an adequacy decision for transfer in UK after Brexit by the end of 2020, which is really good. What will happen till then? Let me tell you, nothing. A lot of consultants trying to scare you are saying, oh my God, you'll need to work with binding corporate rules, standard contractual clauses. Oh my God, what will happen? Really? Almost nothing. There are many other countries in the same situation. Nothing will happen. Follow the GDPR rules. Put the consumer in the, or the data subject in the middle of your core business and look at the interest of the data subject and everything would be fine. Thank you very much. And if there are questions, shout out and I'll repeat the question.